But I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the state floodplain manager working with communities around the state. My coworker Matt, who really helps a lot on the ordinance side and has been doing a lot of the work on our playbook, our substantial damage playbook that we'll mention a few times here today. We're the ones running this today. And let's go ahead and turn mine off. And just a reminder too that in the chat box, you can be putting comments along the way. We'll be trying to monitor that for any time-sensitive questions. And at the end too, if there's other general questions you'd like to ask. So get started here. We'll talk a little bit about some of the local preparation and resources. But then we'll be focusing most of the time today on those post-flood responsibilities for local units of government and on doing substantial damage determinations. And we do have some resources on our website. I'll mention this again at the end, but wanted to point out that we, in the past year, added those. One on preparation, focused for local officials and what your role is, and another video on local official responsibilities for response and recovery. And much of what I'm covering today is in that second video, but we're also talking about some other things. The other thing on this page I want to point out is that there's a lot of resources we refer to in those two. Links to all of those summarized here. So anyway, we've got these two new videos and you can go and listen to them anytime. They're 15, 16 minutes a piece. And there's a lot of other resources that are linked to on that page. So a reminder to look at your county or your community's all hazard plan. There's a lot of really good information in there. Those do get, they're required to be updated on a regular basis. The other thing to look at is, do you have a community disaster response plan? And if so, has it been updated since the last flood or recently, so you've got the most current contacts in there? Something we recommend you be doing annually at least, or if you get new staff in place. The other thing we'll mention, and that we talk about quite a bit in our preparation video, is some of the resources like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Emergency Action Plan Guidebook and some of the other great resources they have at this link. And if you go to that link, you'll see this page here for the St. Paul District Army Corps of Engineers. And I'll point out that in this spot here at the bottom, you can get to the Emergency Action Plan Guidebook here. And that's got a lot of great guidance and steps you through key things that a community should be looking at, and you can go in as much depth or just hit a few of the really key important things that a community should be looking at in preparation. And the Corps is trying to get some workshops set up in a few places around the state. I know they've been trying to get Goodhue, Clay, and I believe it was Wright counties set up. As soon as they're able to do things in person, those will be getting scheduled. And other parts of the state, if you're interested in working together at the community level, and it is really good to have all the different players working together on these plans. So that's why they set up their workshops in person, so they can bring in the emergency managers, the floodplain managers, the people from different communities, and have you all working together on your plans. The other thing they've got on this page is a link to some community resources, a community resource toolbox. And on this page, they've got their flood fight handbook. And that's where you get into more of the nitty-gritty on putting in levees and sandbag dikes and those kinds of things, and how to request resources. There's a lot of great details on flood fighting there. And they've got things like this video on how to do sandbagging. So some great resources there. And at the Department of Labor and Industry, This page here is at this link, and they give resources on how to get help from other building inspectors from around the state, or how you can volunteer to help around the state if you're a building inspector. And they do have a link to their manual, which is this document here. It's been updated several times over the years, and they just updated it in the past year. So if you haven't gotten the most recent copy, you might want to go grab that and review that for your community. So a few other reminders of things that you want to be looking at. Communicating in your community. Who is most at risk? And you know your community's best. The level of risk does vary a lot around the state and even within communities. So who within your community is most at risk, and what kind of messages do they need to hear? And some of the points you might want to be including when you're reaching out to your businesses or to your homeowners would be making them aware of where they are within your high risk mapped areas or locally known risk areas, because remember, FEMA doesn't map all the risk areas. There definitely can be ponding areas or low areas that don't have adequate stormwater management facilities, or you've got stormwater ponds that were put in for a newer development that could be a risk. In some of the metro bigger flood impacts, it was these little stormwater ponds that were the main flooding source. So encouraging them to be aware of what their elevations are and where their risk is, and especially if you can tie them to local gauge information. Now, especially if it's an area where the National Weather Service does have the forecasting. In our video number 1 on the preparation resources, we spend a fair amount of time talking about the different gauges around the state and places to get forecasting information if you're not familiar with that for your area. Another thing that is a concern in many of the communities I see participating today is you've got some kind of a community level flood control project or flood risk reduction project, and having people understand where they are relative to those protections, and if there's areas that need evacuation. Some of your communities, I know, for instance, Moorhead's got a really nice plan showing what areas would need to get evacuated first, and has a really nice interactive site showing how you're impacted in half-a-foot intervals depending on what stage level you get to. Some other things to recommend to folks most at risk would be that they consider getting flood insurance if they don't already have it. As long as your community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, they can get a flood insurance policy. It may have been mandatory if they were in the FEMA high-risk areas, but anyone in the community can get a policy as long as your community is participating. Look at making sure they have their records backed up off-site, and that they have an action plan to keep their business going or to protect it so they can get the business started again as soon as the flood goes through the community. And this is I've got the link to this YouTube. It's about a 30-second information piece on the importance of being prepared, and it's kind of a humorous one. And I did not load things properly for you to be able to hear this today, but the link is in here showing a family basically not being prepared and pointing out the importance of being prepared for emergencies like flooding. And their main point was that the family was going to wing it, and that's not an emergency plan. So some other specifics for you at the community level to be thinking about before you have the flood, or when you know the flood is coming closer. One is that if you have places that you need to be putting up barriers, or you're going to need to be putting in dikes, that you know where that is in advance. So you may have some places that you know you traditionally need to be doing diking, but think about where you're doing that. Make sure that your levees, that your temporary dikes are not going in the floodway areas. And here's where the floodway would be on an older type of paper map and where it would be on the newer maps, these blue and red crosshatched areas. If you're putting these in the floodway areas, you are causing increases in flood elevations beyond what is shown on your FEMA maps, because the mapping, the modeling assumes that those areas are left open for the floodwaters to go through your community. And we mention this because we know there have been communities in the past who have put sandbags and temporary dikes in their floodways, and we don't want you to be doing that. And where are your fill sources? You want to make sure that they're not going to be underwater at the time of flooding. And this is a picture I've used quite a few trainings, and I like it because you can see the soccer goal. You can tell this is not the preferred location for the community to be getting their fill for a temporary dike. I'm sure that they would rather not be ruining their soccer field, but in this case, that was where they had to go because many of their other sources were not available at the time of the flooding. Think about your critical facilities and which ones of those are at risk. And especially if you've got nursing homes or hospitals or prisons or places that you've got vulnerable communities, do they need to have evacuation plans in place? And this is a picture from the Cedar Rapids area in 2008. It's kind of an infamous flood because this is showing buildings on an island in the middle of the river, and they had some of their critical facilities on an island, which of course was not a good situation during times of flooding. They had to get prisoners removed. There were hospitals that were affected. And if you've got that situation in your community, you definitely want to be looking at that ahead of time. And you might have other critical facilities that maybe you can do other things to prevent having to move the folks out of there. Like here at Methodist Hospital, they're able to do some sandbagging and protect the hospital, but there was a lot of work in getting things prepared there. So yep, the point here is then looking at, do you have any places where you need to be evacuating? And this is an example of a campground. And certainly if you have campgrounds that are in flood-prone areas, that's one of those areas where they are more at risk. And we worked with some communities to get some better evacuation plans, especially campgrounds like this example where people basically treat it as a cabin, and they're there for more than a week. They're not just there for a few days and leaving, where they're seasonally. Next slide. So let's transition into the post-disaster. And just in the cartoon, the book says recipes for disaster. Go ahead. So a lot of this is again in our second video on response after a flood. So we'll talk about a few different things here. Go ahead. So the community's first responsibilities are, of course, rescuing people. And your first responders, your emergency managers are going to be out there rescuing people. Next slide. Yeah, again. And while rescuing folks too, you'll get a good idea of where the areas of damage are. You'll be getting reports of damage. You'll be trying to block those parts of the road that are most at risk. Next slide. And a reminder that when there is flooding, go ahead, one more, Matt, that the areas on the road that if they're covered by water, you don't know what's beneath that water surface. So it can be really a dangerous situation like here where the the bridge is completely washed out, and obviously we don't want cars going through those areas. And just like nationally in Minnesota, most deaths due to flooding have been because of people trying to drive through places that maybe they would have been fine during normal times, but they were washed out, and they're where we're most likely to have the dramatic rescues and deaths during flooding. Next slide. Important to grab those documentations of high water marks when you, at the time of flooding or soon after. Here's a more humorous version of getting a high water mark back in 2002. And again, and here's another example of getting that high water mark while you can still see it. That distinction in the coloring on that building's not going to last forever. You want to get out there while you can still see it. And even if you can't survey the elevations, get markers there so you can go back later and survey the actual elevations. Next one. And so this is an example where they put a stake. And here, showing the flood relative to one of the official elevation markers. And people will want to know how high the water really got for after the flood when you're trying to figure out what the damage was and where the areas were damaged. Next slide. And we encourage you to set things up ahead of time and have a way that you're recording what volunteers and staff are spending time responding to the flood, because you'll want that information if there is a state or presidential declaration made. Next slide. And your communications to your community are really going to be important. We've got more options now in terms of websites and social media sites, and that's definitely heavily used in more recent floods. But you'll be wanting to get information out immediately about where to avoid, where the flooding is, where there's risk, where to stay away from. And then as soon as this water starts going down, people will want to know what to do with their debris. And you'll want to tell them how to schedule inspections and remind them that they need permits to do repairs or to go in and rebuild anything in your community. Next slide. We do have our state post-flood substantial damage playbook, we're calling it, for local officials. We're making final tweaks to that and should have that on our website soon. But this is what the cover looks like for that. And many of the things I'll be covering in here are highlighted or listed in this document. And at the end of this document, we have sample letters, sample forms, and other resources that are in the appendices. Next slide. So one of the first things you'll be doing is in addition to the safety actions and rescuing people and blocking areas of concern, you're also trying to record where you're seeing the damage. It might be in a small community, something unsophisticated like this handwritten document that was done in this example by the local official and the area hydrologist at that time. Next slide. But more and more communities have GIS and are able to show that in a nice GIS format and flag properties, flag parcels, and tie it to more detailed examples. And this is actually getting to be like a decade plus old example from Steele County. Next slide. First step is that you're going to be looking at whether buildings potentially are damaged and if they need to be regulated by you through your floodplain management ordinance. So next slide, or next point. First thing you look at is it, oh, you went too far. Is it in your community? And is it in the area that was impacted where you think there might be damaged? And within that impacted area, so in this example, buildings 2 and 4 are in the impacted area and within the community, but only number 4 is actually in the regulated area. The blue area is supposed to be the regulated area, the special flood hazard area. So that's where you need to make sure you're doing inspections for substantial damage and determine what is allowed to be done according to your floodplain management ordinance. Next slide. We do have this flow chart that gives some of the same key steps, and this is an older document, but we still have a link to that on our website, and it steps you through, reminding you that as you want to get out as soon as you can and figure out which buildings need to be looked at more closely that are within your mapped high-risk area that are subject to your floodplain regulations. Next slide. When we talk about substantial damage that you're required to look at, that is, we're looking at mainly those existing nonconformities, the things that were built before you had your map. And so they weren't built knowing the true risk, and they may have been built too low. But if there's damage of any origin, it could be a flood, it could be a tornado, it could be a fire, whatever causes the damage, if it's damaged to more than 50%, that the cost to repair that building, to bring it back to the condition it was in before the fire or before the flood, if that's more than 50%, the cost to do that repair is more than 50% of the market value for the building, then that is considered substantially damaged. And your ordinance says that a building that is substantially damaged needs to be brought into compliance. And what's distinctive here too is that it's not just the work that is actually done or that they want to do to repair, it's what work has to be done to bring it into the pre-event condition. They can't say, well, I'm only going to repair part of it and I'm going to stay under the 50%. You need to look at what's the full cost to repair that building. And we'll get into more detail on doing substantial damage determinations in a little bit here. Next slide. So when do you need to start looking at things? As soon as you can. As soon as that water's going down, and as experienced floodplain managers will tell you, it's while the fish is still flopping on the couch is what we're trying to show here. Keep going. So you'll be getting your inspectors out. You want to have your inspections organized and coordinated as much as you can. You'll see in this example that they're wearing the reflective vests. They've got IDs showing that they're the people that should be out doing the inspections. You'll want to have gotten your right of entries and all those kinds of things, and working together to do the inspections. Next slide. So some of the kinds of inspections you'll have, some of the very first ones will be your building official types out there looking at, is it safe to go back into the building? Is it a health hazard to go back into that building? And you'll also have the assessor's offices out there looking to see how much damage there is, because they'll adjust what taxes are being paid if there's been a lot of damage. And then you, as the local zoning administrators, are charged with determining if it's been substantially damaged or not, or if it's less than substantially damaged, and you can give them a permit to do their repairs. And then another really key set of inspections that's going on around the same time is to determine if there was a big enough flood that it might be eligible for state or federal declarations. One more click. So if it, in that health and safety, the habitable part, they will have placards saying whether it is habitable or not, and if people are allowed to be in that building from a health and safety standpoint. Next slide. I mentioned the inspections being done to see how extensive the damage is and whether it might be eligible for state or federal declaration. And those preliminary damage assessments, or PDAs, are headed up by our Homeland Security Emergency Management Division and our Department of Public Safety. And they work closely with FEMA, the Department of Health, DNR's involved, and others. And just pointing out that there's two main types of these PDAs they would potentially do depending on the kind of damage in the community. Public assistance would be when there's a lot of damage to public roads and infrastructure, the utilities, public buildings, those kinds of things. That's PA, or public assistance. If there's a lot of damage to homes and businesses, then they may also do a preliminary damage assessment inspections for individual assistance. Individual assistance is not as common, especially here in Minnesota. Most of the bigger floods we're having public assistance inspections. Next slide, or next key. For the really big floods, we'll be seeing a lot more involvement from those volunteer organizations like the American Red Cross and others. Next one. This is a nice complete listing that FEMA has, and we've got a link in our resources showing the different kinds of inspections. Oh, and seeing that first column, insurance, I forgot to mention that in the list of potential inspections. One would be those insurance adjusters will be out there looking at what kind of damage was there and is it eligible for an insurance claim. And then we've already mentioned some of the other government and other types of inspections that are going on. But these are things you may want to be sharing with your citizens depending on the level of your disaster and who's going to be at people's doors. Go ahead. So remember that at the local level, you're responsible in following your floodplain ordinance. And that requires that you look at those damaged buildings that are regulated by the ordinance, that it's any of those buildings that are in the FEMA mapped areas in particular. Do one more click. You're going to look for those that are clearly substantially damaged. Next click. You're going to see if there are buildings that are in the area of impact, but you can see that they're clearly not substantially damaged, that you know that you can give them a permit to do any necessary repairs and get back into the home or get back into their business. And then the final part of your main triaging is looking at identifying those buildings that they might be substantially damaged. You're going to need to look at them more closely and look in more detail to determine if they're substantially damaged. Next slide. So you'll be looking at all those impacted areas, and as you're out there screening, you may find other areas that you didn't initially identify. Next click. So one of the big things after floods is looking at where those piles of debris are. That's a very good sign that there's damage in those buildings if there's piles of debris outside the homes and businesses. So some of those substantial damage determinations will be really easy to determine. You'll see that the building is clearly substantially damaged. Next click. This is just a reminder that there's one of the resources that's available as a kind of an abridged version of the FEMA substantially damaged building guidance, and that's this FEMA 213. Next click. And some of the buildings, like this is a metal little accessory structure. You can see the stain line. It's a metal building. It's got the concrete slab. You know that they can go in, hose things down, disinfect things, and that there's not that much damage. It's clearly not going to be substantially damaged. You can get a nice high water mark, and you can give them a permit for any repair that they need to do and log in your records that you've inspected, how high the watermark got and what kind of damage you documented there. Next slide. In basements is where we'll see a lot of the damage during floods. It's and you want to capture those those stain lines. In this example, we've got a seed line that they marked. You're going to want to have a system set up that you've got information by each address, and you tie your photos to those addresses and your inspection records to those addresses. And in most cases, again, there's going to be some cleanup to do, and you'll be sharing information on how to safely clean up and disinfect those areas, but you can give them permits to do the repairs and do the cleanup. Unless you see foundation damage in a basement, you might see that the furnace or the water heater is going to have to be replaced, but you don't usually see substantial damage situations there. Again, document, 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 and keep those records by address. Next slide. One more example of a basement and documenting those damage lines there. So sometimes things are not what they seem from the front. Here we can see the mud line, the high water mark from the front. Next slide. But you should be going around and looking at the buildings. So here's an example where from the front, it didn't look that bad, but you get a look at around the whole building and you clearly have more significant damage. This foundation was burst, and you will have to look more closely at whether this is considered substantial damage or not. Next slide. One more example of pretty significant flooding in a basement and documenting that high water mark. And I do need to say thanks to, especially Winona County, they had a lot of great slides of damages from their 2007 era flooding. In our playbook, we do have some tables, some depth damage tables. These are based on some analysis that the Corps of Engineers had done earlier. Many of the states use these depth tables to help narrow down which areas need to be looked at more closely. So it does vary depending on the number of stories and the foundation type. So this shows the 1 story on slab, 2 stories on slab, and go to the next slide. So zooming in here on the 1 story on slab, that if you've got basically more than half a foot of flooding on that 1 story slab, you're going to need to look at that more closely for whether it's substantially damaged. Again, if it's just in the basement, it's probably not substantially damaged, but if it's getting onto that main floor, that first floor above your basement or crawl space, then you're likely to need to look at it more closely, and it's more likely to have been substantially damaged. Next slide. And you're going to need to document more closely when you get closer to calling it substantial damage, because you're going to be telling people they've got to rebuild in compliance, that they're going to have to elevate that building or do some kind of flood proofing, doing some major work in many cases. So your documentation is going to be especially important in areas where you're going to have to tell them they're substantially damaged. Next slide. So again, we talked about substantial damage is any origin, and you're looking at the market value of the building. You're not looking at the market value of the whole property, just that building that you're looking at, and what the cost is to do the repairs, not the actual work they want to do. Next slide. And this substantial damage definition is part of actually the substantial improvement definition in the FEMA code, 44 Code of Federal Regulations, in the definition section 59.1. Keep going. And that defines it as any reconstruction, rehabilitation, addition, or other improvement of a structure, and includes the Well, this is including the substantial improvement. Keep going. But when you're figuring out the cost, you do not have to include pre-existing health and safety violations that have already been tagged by the community. If your building inspector's already tagged their electric or their furnace and said that they have to replace those, then the cost to replace those don't have to be included in the cost to bring it into the pre-market condition or the pre-damage condition. And also there's some specific guidance for historic structures. One more click. And FEMA's got a nice document on the historic structures and how to handle those when you're looking at damage to historic structures. Keep going. And overall, for substantial improvement and substantial damage, the FEMA desk reference is a very valuable resource. It's about a ½ inch thick, so you'll want to just go to the parts that are most applicable for you, but that's got a link to the whole document. Next slide. And within there, it's got some nice flow charts, points you to the parts where you need to be looking. So you'll be first looking at what is that market value? What's the cost to do the repairs? And how does that compare to the market value? And do you need to have them bring the whole building into compliance? Next slide. Estimating that market value is key. You'll want to be consistent on how you do that. And again, you're looking at the building itself. So you're looking at the market value for that affected structure. You're not looking at the cost to reconstruct the building. You're looking at what the market value is. And I know that in parts of the state, that can be a real difficulty because the market values have been depressed in some areas during the times of floods. And the market value might only be $50,000. So over 50% doesn't take a whole lot of damage. But that's what the law says is the market value. It's not the replacement cost value that you're comparing things to. And what you'll look at is what does your assessor have for the market value for that building. And in some counties, you may need to make an adjustment to that assessed value. If market rates have been going up really fast, you might need to do some kind of an adjustment to get that assessed value to be the market value. But the key thing is to be consistent on how you determine those market values. And then you're going to be providing that to those building owners, those homeowners, those business owners, and you'll want an appeal process for them. The most common way for people to appeal it is they get an official appraisal done by a licensed appraiser or someone who's qualified to do an appraisal. Next slide. We do have a newer form that we've got available on our website now. Most of the form is for a typical permit application, and a part of that form is for these existing non-conforming structures and reviewing the damage or a proposed improvement and how that compares to the market value and whether that's going to be a substantial damage or substantial improvement situation. Again, these forms are a suggested form. You're not required to use these forms, but a resource if you don't have a form you like better. Next slide. So back to the FEMA guidance, that desk reference, they've got some nice specifics on what you have to include in your costs when you're figuring out the cost to bring it back to the pre-damage condition. Do a couple more clicks there. And a couple of the things that people try to not include that you're going to have to remind them they must include are the value of the materials. They can't say, well, I had this sitting on my neighbor's, I took some stuff that my neighbor had extra, or my church donated my materials, so it was no cost to me. Or I just had a bunch of friends come and my cost was a couple cases of beer. That's not what the cost is you need to use for the calculations. You need to look at what the cost would be for a contractor in your area to do that work. So the actual value of the materials that are being used, the value of the labor, and then as FEMA's list of specifics points out, what a contractor's normal overhead and profit would be. So essentially, what it would cost to have a contractor do the work, not someone saying, well, I can do this for $1,000. Next slide. FEMA's guidance also gives some nice specifics of the things that don't have to be included. The cleanup costs, things that aren't part of that building. So other accessories or other, the swimming pool or deck that's a separate deck and those kinds of things. Those don't have to be included in the calculations. Next slide. And then once you've made the determination that it is substantially damaged, you need to send out a formal letter, preferably on community letterhead, saying, we've made these determinations. We've determined you are substantially damaged. You must bring the building into compliance. Include a paragraph in there reminding them or advising them if they have flood insurance that they have the option to use their increased cost to compliance part of their insurance policy. And we'll have a couple more slides about that. But then also this is a letter that we've got as a sample in our playbook that we'll have available on our website soon. So you've got an example of a letter you can be using and modifying for your community. Next slide. So I mentioned the ICC. Anyone who's got a national flood insurance policy, a part of that policy that has been in place since about '94 is something called that increased cost compliance. The FEMA recognized that, gee, we're saying that you have to bring your building into compliance if it's substantially damaged. So there's an additional cost to elevate that building or to move it to another part of the site or for the demolition and rebuilding in another location. There's that extra incremental cost to doing that. So that the cost to bring the building into compliance, we're going to pay in an insurance claim up to $30,000 for the cost to do that. And the things that are eligible, we usually use that acronym FRED, that for floodproofing, if it's the type of elevating wet floodproofing that can be done on a residential building or dry floodproofing on a commercial building, to relocate, to elevate, or to demolish, that those are things that are eligible with this ICC part of the flood insurance. And in order for that person to collect the flood insurance, they must have that letter from the local official officially determining that they were damaged more than 50% and the damage was caused by flooding. Recommendations are being made to open this up to other kinds of damage, but right now this is only applicable if the damage was due to flooding. Next slide. So here's an example of a flooded building. This is actually in Illinois during the flood. And then this is that same building elevated using increased cost of compliance. And this particular county, they are the champions on getting buildings elevated on the Mississippi River and using ICC. They did that with many, many buildings in that community. Next slide. Then a reminder that the ICC is triggered if it's substantial damage, the normal substantial damage greater than 50%, that has to be in your ordinances. But then we've got some other language that we've had recommended in our model ordinance since about 2014. One more click. And in there, we have this language about repetitive loss language triggering it being considered substantial damage. And that is specific language that is used for the ICC to be eligible for the ICC to kick in. that in addition to just 50% from one event making you eligible for the ICC money, that if you have 2 flood-related damages within a 10-year period, and the average of that damage for those 2 events is 25%. So between the 2 of them, they add up to more than 50%. That also makes them eligible to get that $30,000, up to $30,000. And so one more click. So again, making them eligible for elevating, relocating to the high ground, demolishing, or doing some of the floodproofing if it's a non-residential building where that's allowed. Next slide. Another example of a Minnesota elevation project in progress in Winona County. And I'm pretty sure this is an example where they used ICC money. Next slide. And then another reminder that if some things you can only encourage them to build safer. So if, for instance, in that basement, they have their furnace or their water heater is destroyed, they need to replace them, that may not trigger it being substantial damage for the building, but certainly can be encouraging them to, since they have to replace them anyway, to move them up to a safer area or protecting them for the next flood. And you may want to look at your community putting in language that if utilities like this are damaged and have to replace due to an event like this, that they're required to bring them into compliance and bring them up. And we had communities that after the 2012 flood thought they could require people, but when they got some pushback, realized that their ordinance didn't actually require that, so they could only strongly suggest. So before your flood, your next big flood, consider some higher language to require that. Some other things that your community is going to be responsible for, in addition to inspecting those buildings, seeing which ones are substantially damaged, and giving permits for repairs, is that you're going to be out there looking at, again, the damage to your public infrastructure. And if there is a state or federal declaration, then you'll be working with the Homeland Security Emergency Management folks and your emergency managers and filling out those applicant worksheets and going through that process, and definitely getting what instructions you can from our Homeland Security Emergency Management folks. And I know I saw Wayne was listening here. I don't know if he's still on the presentation here, but definitely those are the folks you want to be listening to and following those regulations. The other thing is making sure you're getting applicable permits if any of the repairs involve, say, for instance, replacing culverts or bridges or things that involve a DNR permit. Next slide. When we have a big disaster, we do have a general DNR permit for the repair of flood damages. And this slide shows the general permit number, and that they can be triggered by the federal or state disaster declaration, or the regional manager can be declaring that this general permit is now valid for this particular flood event. And it allows for repairing things without going through the full 30-day review and some of the other steps you have in a normal permit process, so you can get things repaired more quickly. But remember, you don't always want to put the same thing back. A lot of times a culvert or a bridge got blown out because it was not properly sized for that location. Next slide. And when there is a disaster, remember Section 406, that's hazard mitigation funding under the Stafford Act. Again, our Homeland Security Emergency Management folks, they're the experts on following all the FEMA guidelines for public assistance. There's this great policy guide here. Next click. Within there, though, pay particular attention to Appendix J, which talks about some of the areas of mitigation that you can do that don't involve replacing exactly what was there, that there's some things you can do that they've made it easier to do if it's not more than a certain amount of cost over the pure replacement, and it's things that help reduce that risk. One more click. Again, the click. So one of the example is what we call floodplain culverts, putting in some extra capacity within the floodplain in addition to that main culvert. And in the wording here, FEMA tends to call that a relief culvert. So these are things we want to be making sure we take advantage of the opportunity to put in something that's going to be better long term. So we're trying hard to work with our Homeland Security emergency management folks, the emergency managers, on making our communities more resilient so that they don't have to go and replace that same darn culvert, 10 times every time that they have a flood. Next slide. And a reminder too that there's some funding sources out there, especially when there's been a federal disaster. A portion of the money goes into the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and there's a pot of money that doesn't have to be used just in the disaster area. It can be used statewide. There's certain kinds of projects that are higher priority and that are easier to get funded. And talk with our folks over at Homeland Security Emergency Management, our state hazard mitigation grant folks are the SHMO, the State Hazard Mitigation Officer, Jen Davis, and staff in her area. And especially for voluntary buyouts, if they're under certain amounts, and it was at 276. I'm not sure what the current trigger is now, but for the voluntary buyouts that are under a certain amount, they're very straightforward. They don't have all the benefit cost hoops to go through. So that might be something that's a good option for people, especially if they didn't have flood insurance. They're not able to get much in terms of assistance in the community. So, and then BRIC, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, some grants there that so far we haven't benefited from in Minnesota, but hopefully there'll be some changes to make that program better for getting some help in Minnesota and other states that haven't benefited from the first rounds here. And a reminder that we've got our own state grant program, the Flood Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that Pat Lynch oversees. And we've got information on our website about that. And we're just going to blow through a few of these last few slides here, Matt. Remember looking at your all hazard plan. I mentioned that at the beginning. You should have some priorities there of what to do after a flood and mark some areas of mitigation priority. Next slide. And you take advantage of the funding that we've got, those hazard mitigation grant funds and other funds, to work with willing sellers. Here's an example in Granite Falls where they worked with, in that case, actually, it was the downtown businesses and including City Hall that got bought out or got moved. And now they've got some nice park areas in that area, and they've got more safe buildings for their City Hall and other businesses so that they're not putting their volunteers at risk during floods in trying to protect buildings. Next slide. A before and after in Moorhead, where they did things more at the neighborhood level. On the left side, you can see buildings that were on the riverside. On the right side, you can see those riverside buildings were bought out, and there were some community level levees along the river to protect the remaining homes, the homes that remained. Next slide. And The East Grand Forks is a great example of where we had extensive flooding in 1997. Picture here of East Grand Forks at that time. Next slide. Showing the before picture. Next click. The after, showing the levee pulled back from the river, those higher risk buildings being bought out and replaced with recreational facilities and things that won't be damaged as much, and certainly won't put families and at risk during the floods. So a very nice big project that helped reduce that risk in the area. And this is the slide showing some links that we've got on our website. Do the next couple clicks. So I mentioned at the beginning that preparation, response, recovery. And then we've got a lot of our maps and tool resources to help you identify where your areas of higher risk are in those pages on our website. And I think the next one's the last slide. So thanks everyone. And this is the last slide we used in both of our videos, was this picture of a falls on a little, well, not so little river. On the left side, you can see it was during a higher flow period where your emergency managers, your staff's out there making sure everybody's safe. But the picture on the right was taken during a low water period, well, during our drought here in last year and the year before. So during those low water periods, we're doing our planning. During the high water periods, we're responding, doing those inspections, and keeping everyone safe. So thanks, Matt, for running my slides. And I don't know why my connection was so bad again. At the last couple presentations, I was able to do just fine. So we'll stick around and we can stop the recording.